RV University in partnership with Rotary International eClub 3190. To kickstart the proceedings, I request the President of the Rotary International eClub 3190, Mr. Mahesh Iyer, to give his welcome address. Over to you, Mr. Mahesh.
Hi, a warm welcome to all of you on this Sunday. Thanks for taking time out on a Sunday and a weekend, but I'm very happy that you're all here. So good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending on where you are in the world today. We are, as they say, a one large global community. So the Rotary Club, eClub of Bangalore 3190 India are extremely happy to jointly host this International Peace Conference with RV University, which, as you know, is a very prestigious educational group who have established 20 institutions from kindergarten to post-graduation in Karnataka, India. Now, for the past 2 years, the world is fighting COVID-19. And now in February 22, exactly 2 years, we have another war looming. So peace is not a piece of cake. Harmony in what we think, say, or do is a challenge we need to continuously address. So this conference for me is very, very timely. Also during February 22, Rotary International completes its 170th anniversary and re-energizes one of its focus areas, which is peace and conflict prevention and resolution theme. During the last decade, the Rotary Action Group for Peace has helped Rotary advance the cause of global harmony in some form and shape. Rotary, as you know, engages, educates, and empowers its Rotarians interested in peace. We raise the profile of the science of peace and explain the practice of peace for Rotarians. The ultimate goal is to educate humans away from violence and towards cooperation as a survival strategy on Earth. We are interconnected. We live or die together on this planet. People from academia and business also influenced our thinking, and we brought different peace-building ideas from our different Rotary experiences. I see the Rotary principles, the Rotarian Code of Conduct, and the four-way test as the core of Rotary actions and peace-building programs. Therefore, it is very important to recognize and acknowledge that conflict and change are natural and constant, as opposed to conflict resolution, which puts an emphasis on not only simply resolving disputes. Conflict transformation should focus on understanding and remediate the underlying causes that spark conflict to begin with. This conference will build further on ideas that drive various initiatives. Before I hand over the proceedings to our program director, let me introduce Professor Dr. Ysr Murthy. He assumed charge as the first Vice Chancellor of RV University, Bangalore, recently. As a former civil servant from 1975 batch of IAS and allied services, he held many, many responsible and sensitive assignments, including in the National Human Rights Commission, the Prime Minister's Office, the President's Secretariat, the Cabinet Secretariat. Between 2009 and 2020, Dr. Murthy steered the O.P. Jindal Global University during its rapid expansion phase as part of its top leadership team as registrar. Professor Ysr Murthy has published several books, book chapters, and journals. He holds a bachelor's degree and master's in statistics from the University of Madras, MA degree in human rights from the University of London, PhD degree from Tamil Nadu, Dr. Ambedkar Law College, Chennai. He secured university first rank in MSc and also the prestigious British Convening Fellowship. We are looking forward to all your collective thought leadership today. Over to Rotarian Dr. Y.S. Murthy, Vice Chancellor of RV University, to take on the program today. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Mahesh Iyer. Thank you for the generous introduction.
Okay, over to you, sir.
Okay. Warm greetings to all participants from different time zones, ranging from Australia to USA, who are attending this conference on Zoom, and those who are participating on YouTube platform. The RVA University is delighted to partner with Rotary to organize this international conference on peace, conflict prevention, and resolution. Our objective is to understand the nature of contemporary challenges to peace and to identify practical solutions and strategies. Today, the world is experiencing its biggest challenge since the Second World War. There is mindless death, destruction, and displacement of more than 100,000 civilians from Ukraine into neighboring European countries. One does not know how this conflict will end. With some countries acquiring the technology to shoot down satellites, weaponization of outer space is a sad reality. There are serious concerns about nuclear weapons landing into the hands of terrorists and non-state actors. Today, killer robots, drones, guns, and bombs that decide on their own with artificial brains whether to attack and kill are no longer in the realm of fiction. They have been developed and their prototypes have been tested in actual conflicts. 2 months back, a meeting in Geneva to regulate them proved inconclusive, with many countries calling for their ban, while a few countries like US and Russia, which are developing them, held out. These autonomous weapon systems raise many ethical concerns. There are serious gaps in the international legal framework and international humanitarian law to regulate lethal autonomous weapons, cyber warfare, and such emerging challenges like use of artificial intelligence in an armed conflict. According to the UNHCR, over 82 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced at the end of 2020 as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations, or even seriously disturbing public order. Civilians, women, and children bore a disproportionate impact of conflicts. The preamble of the UN Charter refers to our determination to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold misery to mankind. There is an urgent need to understand root causes of conflict and evolve strategies to address them. In this conference, we have 2 panels. The first one addresses the role of educational institutions in promoting peace. The preamble to the UNESCO Constitution asserts that since wars began in the minds of men and women, it is in their minds that the defenses of peace must be constructed. In this context, education and mass media can play a very important role in building a culture of peace. We have an eminent academic from the Harvard University and a distinguished human rights practitioner, Professor Stephen Marks, who will moderate this session. A number of experts from top educational institutions are in panel 1 to address a range of questions. The second panel will address the strategies for conflict prevention and resolution. It will explore the role of rights-based approaches to conflict resolution, truth commissions, women and children, and international community. We have an eminent panel with experts from the civil society, as well as career diplomats working with the United Nations who will address these issues. We are privileged to have Professor Vaseline Popowski, who had worked for over a decade at the United Nations University, Tokyo, as the officer in charge of Peace and Governance Program, and also as the head of Peace and Security Section, with us to moderate this session. I welcome the moderators and the distinguished speakers of both the panels to this conference. With these few words, I once again welcome all participants to this international conference and request Professor Stephen Marks to take over and conduct the first panel discussion. Over to you, Professor Stephen Marks.
Thank you very much indeed, Ysr. It is indeed an honor for me to be part of this important event, and I want to thank you and congratulate you on the founding of RV University, Bangalore. And it is a great pleasure for me to be part of this session and to help moderate it. This session will benefit from, as you mentioned, leading authorities on school, college, and university teaching and research on peace studies and education. Before turning the floor over to them, I would like to confirm what the president of the Rotary eClub, Mahesh Iyer, and you said about the current crisis that we are in. The war taking place now in the Ukraine reveals a tragic backsliding of peace as a guiding value of international relations. Indeed, the international system is witnessing the tragic rejection of the core understanding of peace dating back to the founding of the post-World War II global system. The strict prohibition of violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of another country was the premise on which the international peace system was built. In addition to the references made by you, Ysr, to UNESCO's constitution and the reference therein to wars beginning in the minds of men, and you added and women, of course, the text says and men, and it is mainly men who do this. And you also alluded elsewhere to resolutions of the General Assembly on United Nations peace-building architecture and the report of the Secretary General on peace building and sustainable peace. I would like to draw the attention of the participants in this panel to two other historical precedents that form the backdrop of what I see as peace education, which is the focus of this panel. References have been made to human rights, and we all know that the founding document is the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But have we considered the content and meaning and value today of Article 26, paragraph 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reads as follows: education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, friendship among nations, racial and religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Ysr Murthy is a good friend, and I admire the work that he did when we were colleagues together at Opijinda Global University, and I truly admire what he has done in his career. We've known each other well for a number of years, but he might not be aware that earlier in my career, I would venture even before he was born, I had the responsibility over the peace education program at UNESCO. One of our major undertakings at that period in the early 70s at UNESCO was the 1974 recommendation, and I'm giving you the full title, Concerning Education for International Understanding, Cooperation, and Peace, and Education Relating to Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. This text was adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO in Paris in 1974. That was half a century ago. In the recommendation, education is defined as the entire process of social life by means of which individuals and social groups learn to develop consciously within and for the benefit of the national and international communities, the whole of their personalities, capacities, attitudes, aptitudes, and knowledge. Education, thus defined, combines learning, training, information, and action. The recommendation of 1974 details steps states should take to develop and infuse an international and intercultural dimension at all stages and in all forms of education, as well as national policy, planning, and administration, teacher preparation, research and experimentation, and international cooperation. Those ideas of how to build peace education of a half century ago are as relevant today as they were then, and perhaps even more so. The field of peace education has, of course, developed a lot since then, and let me take advantage of this opening of panel one to draw your attention to a book written by a very close friend of mine and a leading voice in peace education, Betty Reardon. She's in her 90s now and is still with us and still contributing to peace education. She wrote this book in 1988 and updated it just a few months ago in 2021. It's called Comprehensive Peace Education, Educating for Global Responsibility. It has been described as one of the first and clearest articulations of the field of peace education in theory and practice. Of course, she distinguishes peace studies, the formal courses on peace and conflict studies based on peace research, from peace education, which is a comprehensive learning process. These nuances will no doubt come out in the presentations by our panelists. Another useful distinction she makes is between negative peace, arms races, war, violent conflict, and positive peace, tolerance, understanding of others, international understanding, nonviolence, elimination of poverty, sustainable environment, human rights, social justice. She does not hesitate to see the transformational quality of peace education and to outline the dimensions of comprehensive peace education. The book ends with an overview of significant works on peace education, including an updating of works from the period of 1988 to 2020. So with this reminder of some backgrounds on how peace education has evolved, I would like now to introduce our four panelists who will shed light on the role of educational institutions in promoting peace. We will hear from Dr. Jagannathan, who is the head of the Department of National Security Studies at Central University of Jammu. We will then hear from Ms. Annapurna Ramachandra, who is principal, Delhi Public School, Electronic City, Bangalore. And then we will hear from Dr. Paravelan, who is the chair of the Center for Statelessness and Refugee Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Studies in Mumbai. And finally, we will hear from Professor Samrat Sinha, Executive Director of the Center for Border Studies at the Jindal School of International Affairs of OP Jindal Global University. So I would now like to turn the floor over to our first panelist, Dr. Jagannathan, and ask you, sir, if you would address the question in light of what we have just heard and of the efforts to clarify the meaning of peace in the past in the context of peace education. Could you please address for us the question of what does peace mean today and how can we achieve it? I have the honor of turning the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Marx, and thank you, Professor Murthy and Sri Magesh Iyer, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on the topic. And once again, I thank all the panelists. It's a very august panelist to discuss on one of the most important issue, and it is very much required. And over the last in the past decade, this topic has been somehow slipped out of this mainstream academic discourse, at least in the global platforms. Otherwise, 2 decades ago, this has been the topic we're discussing about. Theoretically, we are discussing about contemplating on the concept of peace, and also the various aspects of the peace, how the conflict prevention, studying of the conflicts and the cases that has been there since the end of the Cold War. And I really appreciate the efforts being taken now to bring this one of the most important topic that concerns all of us in various levels, brought to the sort of an intellectual engagement with re-looking at and revisiting this concept in the contemporary context. Let me say that we have gathered today in the light of that what we have been seeing last 2 days, where the recent the Russian attack on Ukraine, that actually sort of brought somehow I'm afraid that are we going back to 100 years back, and what would happen to the efforts which have been made the last 7, 8 in almost a century to build a sort of a peaceful world order, and many institutions were created. And let me highlight the point that this is not the conflict that what we are witnessing now. This is the first time that we are witnessing a sovereign state is attacking on another sovereign state. It's a sort of a classic state, sort of a war. So now it is time to relook at it, what we understand about the concept of war and the concept of peace. And it also put me in a sort of a very dicey position that I need to go back and see the concept of peace. What we have studied from the strategic point of view. We studied about the war in the past. We studied back in even the 1648 the Treaty of Westphalia, where the sovereignty clause was brought in. So we have studied many wars from the Western, sort of perspective about the way we define the peace. What I see is that the simple definition that we all would agree, it's a sort of a universal term when you treat this concept peace, which means an absence of violence, or to an extent, if you extend that, it's an absence of hostility, or sort of an establishment of harmony. The term became very philosophically, it became very popular when Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, has wrote The Perpetual Peace, the philosophical sketch, that actually set a tone for this entire academic discourse, or even to contemplate on the concept. But what I find it that it is more of a sort of an external and a sort of a defining peace in an absolute terms. Then I put this concept to see in a sort of a comparative perspective how the Indian philosophers looked at this concept. I'm not going to deep into sort of a philosophical analysis, but trying to draw some insights to understand properly that what that concept mean, and which sort of insights that it will be very helpful to understand the contemporary context or the contemporary issues. For the Indian philosophers, the long period, and they have been contemplating on this concept. The term is coined as a Shanti. It's more or less a sort of in a relative term, and it's a sort of a means to achieve particular end. Unlike the Kantian perspective of peace, which itself an end, which itself an end. So the states pursued the policies and whatever the strategies and the institutions were built in the last 100 years to ensure that it established to achieve the peace. That's the rationale for the League of Nations was created to sort of advance the project of establishing a peaceful world order. And later on, we had this World War II. Again, this project peace was taken up, and with understanding of the realistic concerns of the nation states, the Committee of Nation States, and addressing their personal interest, their own national interest, and sort of come out with the realistic framework with the recognizing the power, the competition for power, and the balance of power among the powerful nations. In terms of a sort of a materialistic assessment of these powerful nations. As a result, we had sort of an equilibrium that was established in terms of the power equilibrium. So that had provided sort of in a peaceful world order. So we had this entire, the last 50 years, that equilibrium was maintained. In fact, would be the very sort of in a realistic assessment from the IR point of view. Which is that equilibrium, as long as you maintain that equilibrium, the power equilibrium among the great powers or the superpowers, there is a sort of a stability, or sort of in a peace, but it's very in a short time, but it's not in a sort of perpetual peace what Immanuel Kant has proposed. Now, what is the challenge to that equilibrium? Whether the equilibrium has been disturbed or been affected in the recent events. So I'm not going back. I'm just reading the series of events that panned out in the last the 1 decade from I would say from the post 9/11. We can sort of discussing on this thing. If the Ukraine context, I would say that there is why the war has happened and what the Putin wanted from Ukraine and why he had to, even if Putin wanted that Ukraine should not join NATO, become a NATO membership, although their NATO membership process has been there for a long period, more than a decade, but still the attack was sort of a surprise. Perhaps the Putin realized that the equilibrium, the power equilibrium between the Russia and the United States after a long 4 decade, maybe after 70s, 80s, it is in favor of Russia. Perhaps he would have felt that equilibrium is the power shift is in favor of him, with the economic giant China along his side. And also there is a need to return the new world order. I don't know what sort of world order are they envisaging. We have no idea about it. But what I see is that there is an attempt, to bring back the sort of an authoritarian regime, to rewrite and revisit the international norms and the international order, rule-based order, the Western-centric international order. So this is sort of a macro point of view. But if you look at the Indian scholars, the Indian education system, go back to this ancient system, it was promoting peace in three different levels. It's a more of an individualistic. It is more realized in the individualistic terms. The body, mind, and soul. That if your mind is, many slokas and Vedas have discussed about it. Bhagavad Gita was mentioned about it. In fact, Bhagavad Gita is the best example that I would say. In the midst of the war, the battlefield, a man who has a still mind, who's steering the chariot, could deliver a wisdom. So that is a sort of, if your mind is still, mind is calm or peaceful, then your body becomes calm and peaceful. If your body becomes calm and peaceful and controlled, then your surroundings become peaceful and controlled. Will control over harmonious. If the surroundings become harmonious, that your house become very harmonious. If your home is peaceful and harmonious, then that village becomes peaceful and harmonious. So it is sort of a gradual expansion. If a village is peaceful and harmonious, then the town or the city become harmonious and peaceful. Then it is become entire world become peaceful and harmonious. So it is a gradual expansion of the individual's state of mind and what he does. That's more of an individualistic point of view, that the peace has been defined in that concept. Now, the second question that, how do you achieve the peace? Achieve peace. So one is a perpetual peace. Are we going to achieve? That depends on that how we treat the peace and engage the concept. So I'd like to wind up by saying that in today's context, from the international relations or politics context, again, I would highlight this. Even this midst of war between Ukraine and the Russia or any other sort of conflict, what we need to understand, because we have been hearing this, that the UN has failed. When it comes to UN, always there is a blame that the United Nations as an institution has failed to restore peace or build peace, or even even the case of Sri Lanka, that it has been blamed. Even in the case of Ukraine, last 3-4 days, we have been getting this in the social media. It has been blamed that the United Nations have been failed. But what is the United Nations? Who are there in the United Nations? And so it is a time to United Nations to revisit on their the understanding of what peace means. Now here comes the role of education, because now we are in the in a metaverse era. So we have sort of many challenges and many domains that we are living in, and we are working on it. For that, time is changing now. We need to, we need to change ourselves and engage the sort of the issues. So I would, I have feeling that, I visited United Nations. I was a young fellow there in 2007 Fall Academy. We are very idealistic and a lot of expectations and the hope that the United Nations is the ultimate body where any states can seek for peace and stability. Even the community can seek that sort of an expectations. But are we having, particularly from the developing countries or the third world countries, the so-called, now there is no third world countries, I'm sorry to use this word, but the so-called third world countries, you would say, are south. There was an expectations, but now that is diminishing. And I'm afraid, I cannot imagine a world without United Nations. At least United Nations is there, some sort of giving some scope, some hope for these countries or the communities which is in distinct or facing conflict in their respective areas. So there, the United Nations has to re-engage on this theme. Coming back to the last point, that the role of education, as I said, in the ancient Indian system, the institution's role is to engage the youngsters and building their characters and make them a more sort of constructive human being when they move into the society. So, but what we are witnessing in the university system is like more of sort of the character building is not there. Rather, we are trying to it's sort of a more of career building courses, or the career building mechanism is there. I think that needs to be addressed, that gap, that how we can engage these youth, because that they are the one who is going to be define what the peace and all. So thank you very much for this. This is a submission, and once again I thank you very much. I look forward to have more questions.
Thank you very much indeed, and you've provided us with the precise transition from the strategic studies, security studies perspective that you presented so brilliantly to the challenge to education and the values that are transmitted through education. And that is the question that I would like Ms. Ramachandra to address. How can schools, or what can schools do to inculcate the right values about non-discrimination, respect for human rights, and thereby promote peace? In other words, this concept of positive peace. What is the role of schools in that regard? I now give you the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Professor Marks, for that question. Whenever we think of peace or speak of peace, the people who come to our minds are people like Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, or Gandhiji, and many other champions of peace. The most encouraging part of this question for me is that schools are now being considered as agents of instilling peace. Schools should be places where we are ideally preparing students for the future. What is this future that we are speaking about? An uncertain world. If we go by the pace of development in all fields, the unrest that's happening in the environment for the most frivolous of reasons, and the number of agents who are trying to play on the vulnerable minds, it is of no surprise that individuals are going to be faced with conflicts both personally and professionally in future. How then do we at schools inculcate the right values that will help them resolve these conflicts? To begin with, I personally like to deconstruct strategies so that we work at the grassroots level with simple solutions. So I'll briefly be sharing what we do at our schools so that my sharing doesn't sound like a sermon. I just want to reiterate that we practice what we preach. At any given point of time, our school has students and teachers from most of the states and union territories in India, and sometimes other parts of the world also. The easiest way to build appreciation for one's culture and tolerance for the other is to accommodate and celebrate the diversity that we have. This has to start very early on in a child's life, is what I believe. So we organize something called the Matrabhasha Divas, or the Mother Tongue Day, in the kindergarten classes and primary classes, where students and teachers are encouraged to wear their state's attire, bring in food from their region, speak in their mother tongue to their fellow classmates and colleagues, and put on display the special art forms of their culture. This may look like any other festive day at school for an outsider, but deep within it is our endeavor to build solidarity for diversity in our environment. Games and sports is a mandatory activity in our school, not only to produce a future MS Dhonis and Mary Coms, but also to train students to accept victory and loss with dignity. The words of Mr. Anil Suri in his article, which I read very recently on LinkedIn called Schools and Sports Can Avoid Wars and Violence, he sums up beautifully the role of team sports in schools. And he says, I quote, "The game builds character, ingrains respect for the opponent, turns aggression into constructive output, highlights sportsman's spirit in standing for justice, values a worth of humanity, teammates and opponents become the best of friends, and realize the worthlessness of individual self-centeredness," unquote. We organize model United Nations and model parliaments at the school level to teach students that resolving a conflict does not mean going with the majority, but negotiating and reasoning with the dissenting voices. This sets the right tone for working towards peace through common consensus rather than neglecting the concerns of the lesser numbers. Visiting the orphanage, old age homes, hospitals are not merely school trips or fads of elite schools. They're attempts to sensitize children with a larger picture of the basic issue of human rights, rising above the pettiness of individual wants and desires. All instances of disruption of peace and violation of human rights originate with an individual or group of individuals who are not in peace with themselves. There is someone out there with unfulfilled dreams, society not accepting them the way they are, and is suffering probably from identity crisis. Schools have a critical role to repair such individuals. Teachers and parents should work together to identify children who suffer from issues of self-worth, biased approach to issues, aggression and non-communication, and do the needful intervention, counseling, and probably peer mediation to equip the students handle the challenges better out there in the society. Involving all the stakeholders while taking major decisions that affect the school goes a long way in establishing mutual respect for peaceful coexistence. When there is an issue of conflict, listening to the other side is as important as timely and open communication of expectations. The kind of language and tone used in schools by teachers, students, parents should always be cordial, non-derogatory, and respectful. A balance is to be struck while planning for co-scholastic activities that we organize and celebrate events representing all religions and ethnic groups. If you walk into our school, you will see no symbol of any religion displayed in any part of the infrastructure. This is to ensure a sense of security and belongingness to each student, teacher who comes here. We celebrate Diwali, Eid, Onam, Halloween, Christmas, and all other festivals with equal aplomb and fervor. The national festivals are the biggest celebrations in our school to instill a love for the nation and pride in citizenship. Our annual days are planned very consciously so that there is a display of art forms, festivals, lifestyles, languages, literature, mythology from different parts of the country and world. It is a holistic representation of secularism in the truest sense. All staff meetings will intentionally include discussions on fair practices of functioning, promoting better behavior by all stakeholders, and peaceful ways of conflict resolution so that staff members are equipped to handle such situations with better knowledge and skills. We stock books of different languages and cultures appropriate for children in libraries. We let students plant and nurture saplings on the school campus on their birthdays. Let them spend time with livestock in farmhouses. This is to enable them to become voices of the voiceless. Although English is the medium of instruction, all other languages are welcome to be used for communication. The cafeteria serves food from all parts of the country to make a statement that we care about everyone's needs. Teachers closely monitor healthy, unbiased classroom discussions on current affairs like the Ukraine situation, the hijab issue, the effects of the pandemic on schooling, the neighboring lake being polluted, to help them differentiate between authentic and fake news and make decisions based on truth rather than rumors. Also, to sensitize them that conflicts can be resolved through talks instead of extreme actions disrupting community peace. Our students participate in collaborative learning programs on relevant topics with students from different states and countries across the world so that they understand global citizenship better. We organize many programs towards social commitments like crowdfunding for cataract operations for the elderly, or organizing runathons and walkathons to set up reading rooms in the neighboring schools and educating girl children. And they are part of programs to build digital content for benefit of the lesser privileged children. They are also part of the Interact Club of the Rotary eClub of Bangalore that I'm a part of too, and have worked on projects of greening the environment and mental well-being of fellow students. Scholastic and co-scholastic activities like these empower the students with the influence of how they could use their resources to help build lives rather than digress and invested in doing otherwise. If schools channelize the power of the young students in the right ways, it is very unlikely that they will go on to use their power to destruct or destroy anything. I could go on and on of the many things that we do at our schools. All these may not sound actually like grand ideas, but I believe that it is this very attention to minor details that add up to inculcating the right values about non-discrimination, respect for human rights, and thereby promoting peace. And this is what we do at our schools. I would like to sum up my presentation by reiterating that schools are miniature representations of societies, countries, and the world, as mentioned by my fellow panelists before me. They're melting pots of diverse cultures with stakeholders from varying social, political, economic, psychological, and educational backgrounds. Adults in the schools should strive to establish a culture of mutual respect and peaceful resolution of conflicts and difference in opinions. Children are the finest imitators and learn best from role model behavior rather than lectures of right attitudes and approaches. We should focus on assisting them to make a choice between the right and wrong, even when they are on their own. As Philip Woolen has said in a speech in the in the UN, peace is not just the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. Justice should not be blind to race, color, religion, or species. Since we work with the most impressionable minds, schools are the most perfect places to instill and nurture the values for peaceful existence and coexistence. Let us be mindful that we are nurturing future peacekeeping troops, both in thoughts and actions, in our very own classrooms. Let us do everything it takes to prepare them for that future role. The 21st century skills of communication and collaboration are to be taught not just for better careers, but also for enhanced quality of life and true happiness of the individual. I would like to sincerely thank Dr. Ysr Murthy, the Vice Chancellor of RV University, and Rotarian Mahesh Iyer, President of the Rotary eClub of Bangalore District 3190, for organizing this webinar and giving me an opportunity to present my views on the topic. May peace prevail upon all of us. Thank you all for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much for those inspiring words. And I would now like to move from the school level to higher education and ask Dr. Paravelan to address the question of how can higher education institutions play a role in promoting peace? Sir, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Stephen Marks. At the outset, my heartfelt thanks to Professor Ysr Murthy and the Rotary Club jointly hosting this important discussion on conflicts and peace and its relevance. I was just wondering, when UN or even OCHA failed to provide us any foresight on this very conflict, it looked like Professor Ysr Murthy had some kind of an insight on emerging conflict Russia getting into Ukraine, and it looked very, very apt and timely kind of a conversation we are having. Thanks. I do not know whether it's a matter of coincidence that we are looking at this theme, which is very, very apt and timely. Thank you very much. Looking at the role of, higher education, I just thought that, we need to a little bit contextualize the relevance of peace by juxtaposing with, conflicts which are both at the interstate level and at the intrastate level, which has been prevailing. World wars have taught us a lot of lessons, and we have created, mechanisms which could prevent. But unfortunately, the Cold War era took us through a series of quite a bit of interstate conflicts. And the end of Cold War era again seemed like opening up of a lot of intrastate conflicts. But as Professor Ysr Murthy had already indicated, as per the UNHCR sources, that it's kind of crossing 82.4 million people forcefully displaced due to a variety of reasons, conflicts, human rights violations, discriminations, and variety of them, which even constitutes a component of, refugee statelessness, all included in this thing. But looking at the current ongoing conflict, in Ukraine, already, I think 150,000 people reportedly got displaced. It's going to, I think, touch almost up to 3 to 4 lakh people. So it's going to compound these very numbers we have. It's a matter of concern in that sense. So how do we prevent conflicts? How do we mitigate the negative consequences of forced migration, involuntary displacements is a matter of concern. Has already been also highlighted within the realm of peace. We have positive peace and negative peace. We are looking at how we can promote the positive piece, not just the negative piece. I was remembering when I had a context of traveling to Sri Lanka, part of my study on Sri Lankan refugee repatriation and their durable solutions. When I was interacting with Dr. Sarvana Muthu of CPA, Center for Policy Alternatives, he was quoting an important and powerful quotation from a Jaffna resident in the post-war context. When that resident was asked, how do you feel after the 2009 war has ended? He said, things are better, but feeling worse. It sounded very philosophical, very important for us to understand the context that there may not be bombings, there may not be shellings, there may not be any gunfires, but feeling worse, meaning that somebody who has not got into a process of reconciliation, process of relief or rehabilitation or resettlement. It's that kind of a frustration. It's not that absence of bombs and guns alone, lead to a peace. That's a very poignant thing I felt. I had recorded that in my report as well. So things are better, but feeling worse in a post-war context tells us that it's not just the absence of bombs and guns and fires that which makes us feel peace. So I think the importance of positive peace is all about how one could, contextualize that there is in an attempt to address some of the structural, fundamental asymmetries, indifferences, discriminations, inequalities. I think these are all very important. Post Cold War era, the intrastate conflicts which got magnified, made us to understand again that nation states are getting into ethnic, religious, sectarian, cultural, linguistic identity, and mostly of the majoritarian projects which led to a lot of conflict. I think South Asia, the majoritarianism, I think, is the most important challenge, be it India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal. I think Bangladesh, one can see around that the mirror images of how the minorities get discriminated, and a lot of fault lines do emerge from this arena, which are very important for us to take into context. Just keeping this into context, let me delve into a few examples how we may have to address the asymmetries and inequalities, human rights protection, access to justice. These are all very important. It's not access to justice just from the point of view of access to legal aid or something. Here I'm trying to highlight the socio-economic justice as well. As a country in transition, transformation, we need to address the inequalities at all the levels. Now, some of the macro examples within the Indian context, when we talk about conflict and peace, definitely one looks at the Kashmir issue, one looks at the Northeast region, one looks at the central India, embedded with left-wing extremism or the Maoist conflict, as it is said. So here I'm coming now with this brief context. The role of higher educational institutions are, I think, very important in peace building and promotion, peace promotion, teachings, developing curriculum, pedagogy with field exposure, research, publications, awareness, capacity building, training programs. These are all very important. Saying so, having said this, I would like to take few examples from what, experientially we are doing at Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Some in the past, some in my, since 2012, I'm here. Taking in the left-wing extremism in itself as an example. When I came in 2012, already I think this program had started from Tata Institute, which had seen this very left-wing extremism from a different lens, not just from internal security or internal conflict perspective, but they saw it, quote unquote, as development deficit challenge. It sounded very interesting. Development deficit as the cause of the conflict. So the government of India, I believe, asked a question to Tata Institute director then, Professor Parasuraman and others. What do you want to do here? They have proposed a model where they will take young volunteers who will go to the field and be a bridge between the government and the communities who are far marginalized, vulnerable, and neglected. And therefore, they said that we would like to bridge the gaps between the developmental needs of the people, bring appropriate programs, and be a connect. And that is how the program called Prime Minister's Rural Development Fellowship emerged, PMRD, very popular, interesting program. So all over the country, in the second phase, I had the opportunity to be part of the team to recruit young people and then train them and then send them to the conflict zones, who will go and work with the people, observe, and then do the conflict mitigation, conflict resolution. Sounded quite interesting. This package became very, very interesting, PMRDF, for the fact that we collaborated with Ministry of Rural Development and closely set up the model where 2 cohorts were, implemented, 150 volunteers in each. And I think most of them have joined bureaucracy. Most of them have, become part of the developmental and civil society groups today. And this, I call it as one model, an example of a praxis, what TIS does about theory and practice. This was very successful one, 2 cycles, 150 each. It went very.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. We're going to have to worry about time here because we do have one more.
I'll just take a minute to wrap up. Yes, sure.
Thank you very much indeed.
Quickly, a couple of more examples. One that, within the TIS, after my arrival, we have done a program in collaboration with the Bureau for Police Research and Development, a training for IPS officers, sensitizing them the social profile. When the officers come in, they seem to project that they know more than others do. And when we bring them the social aspects, social vulnerabilities, and how do you do the community peace building and other things, it goes very successful in that way. TIS had also collaborated with the post-war Afghanistan earlier phase, that I think Taliban 1 phase, where it had done some peace building in curriculum development for gender empowerment and peace building, child rights protection in conflict and post-conflict situations. One can say so. Due to paucity of time, I would like to just flag 1 or 2 more and just wind up that since the partition time, the refugee camps in Kurukshetra, to number of other natural disasters, man-made disasters, TIS had involved. And I feel that these are all important part of the peace building, and these all feed back into the curriculum, which I feel that many other universities also need to come into this, where they contribute to direct field work and contribute to the peace building endeavor. With the last statement that TIS had collaborated with His Holiness Dalai Lama, peace building courses, some of them based on empathy and compassion in the globalized world, secular ethics, and even a course called compassionate capitalism. With this, I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I do apologize. I failed to maintain the control over the time because we do have to end in just a very few minutes, and we have not yet heard from Professor Samrat Sinha, would you please now take the floor and address the question of how research can contribute to understanding of the root causes of conflict and their resolution?
Great. Thank you so much to the esteemed panelists and the organizers of this wonderful conference. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to speak here, and more so to listen to these very interesting perspectives that have just been presented by our esteemed panelists. Saying that, I will structure my presentation in such a way to consolidate some of the points that were presented and especially look at it from the perspective of the idea of social science research. And I've actually used a case study for this particular presentation on looking at the context of conflict in India and the state response to conflict, especially on what is not known or where there is an absence of evidence and what initiatives can be taken to strengthen that evidence base. One of the big challenges in the Indian context is that there has been a history of course, internal conflict over various situations that Professor Parivelan had also identified. However, the impact on education of these particular conflicts is still quite unknown as a result of the absence of systematic studies that are done on this particular subject. The global situation, it's quite interesting to see the global situation in terms of how education is impacted by conflict and where does India get situated in that. The global situation, if you're looking at conflict, is extremely serious. And if you look at the Global Coalition for the Protection of Education in Armed Conflict, we are now seeing an increasing trend where attacks on education, which can be defined as any intentional threat or use of force carried out for political, military, ideological, sectarian, ethnic, religious, or criminal reasons against students, educators, and educational institutions are increasing. For instance, in the last, if you look at the last 6 years, there have been 11,000 recorded attacks on educational institutions globally, and several reasons can be attributed to that. One, of course, is the changing transformation in war, in the idea of the fact that the newer actors are emerging in conflict who are using newer forms of weaponry, and more so, whose normative frameworks are changing, where the idea that you can attack institutions that are vulnerable, right? The fact that you are attacking children who are vulnerable. And when we define attack, it's not only violence. It also refers to the recruitment of youth, the recruitment of children into armed groups. It also looks at the recruitment of children for in terms of sexual violence, in terms of slavery, in terms of human trafficking. So there are a high level of vulnerabilities that are now emerging globally as a result of these overall trends, especially the normative changes that I've just referred to. One of the reasons, of course, is that the idea of these global norms, which I alluded to in the initial part of the discussion today. For instance, if you look at international humanitarian law, if you look at the extensive work that is being done by Unesco and UNICEF and among other various agencies, one of the problems is that international law is very distant for actors who are, let's say, armed actors who are politically motivated and are looking at or who are living in the immediacy of the conflict and who are more influenced by local norms and local political structures. So the big challenge in terms of looking at the problem of attacks on education in terms of evidence building is primarily this. One, that these most of the armed actors are localized. Second, they have their own normative frameworks and their own motivations for engaging in violence against education institutions, whether they are higher education institutions or on school-going children. Very quickly, in the Indian context, we have also reflected a certain global trend where schools have become targets and actual targets as a result of the extensive conflict situations that we have experienced in the past since post-independence. The problem, of course, is that the data is not recorded, but a couple of examples can be provided. For instance, if you look at the areas in central India where what you call Naxal violence, schools have been systematically targeted, especially at a peak period between around 2006 to 2014, where we recorded nearly 800 attacks on schools, right? And this also includes, of course, not only institutions, but also school children and teachers and so on and so forth. The second aspect, of course, has been that in areas that are remote, you do find that schools become one of the only institutions capable of providing some degree of fortification. And as a result of which, you do see a problem where schools become fortified and become bases of operations. Now, the problem that happens there is the indirect impact of that, where children, it becomes very difficult for the school management to actually maintain their school calendar. There's a huge disruption in the school calendar. You see the fact that schools get underutilized or get abandoned as a result of this kind of militarization. Another big problem that is emerging, which especially in our Indian context, which again, I must say that this is very little data on, is the impact of displaced populations, the impact of or the destruction of the education system for people who are displaced, right? So in terms of their access to schooling, the weakness, the fact that they are not provided schooling inside relief camps or refugee camps, and so on and so forth. So if we have a comprehensive view of the situation in India, it is actually a very serious situation. At the same time, I must say that in terms of knowledge building in the Indian context, because of our own administrative systems, there is still some hope in terms of advocacy and in terms of capitalizing on the existing systems and structures at the district level. So several innovative methods have been developed as a result of our own, let's say India's approach to trying to resolve these problems internally. Those innovations need to be captured. And this is where research, I would say, actually comes in. One, just as conflict is localized, research allows us to capture local lessons that are also positive. It is not only that a conflict situation is purely a negative situation. At the same time, there can be innovations that exist. For instance, we had what is called Bal Bandhu scheme that was run by the NCPCR. Examples like PMRDF, for instance. There is a need for building the evidence of what were the positive practices that came out of it and what was effective and what wasn't.
Samrat, we have to wind up. We're out of time, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. So in conclusion, I think the role of research is very, very important in a couple of things. Two special points. One, in terms of ensuring that the empirical reality is captured, which allows us to adjust the existing government policies, which might be out of sync with what is actually going on the ground. So this is where an important role of social science research comes about. Another role, of course, is to ensure that there is some degree of convergence in terms of the various government and non-governmental programs being implemented, and to ensure that there is some degree of convergence in the scheme implementation and in creating an environment where linkages can also be promoted between different schemes. Hence, the need for monitoring, evaluation, to bring in the best practices globally, and so on and so forth. So with that, I'd like to just conclude and discuss more in terms of Q&A.
Thank you very, very much indeed. We've covered a lot. We have not had much time for a real exchange, but there's another panel that was supposed to start 4 minutes ago, with my friend Veselin Popovsky, who I see is here. So Ysr, I guess I turn it back over to you, unless you want us to continue how would you like to proceed?
There are a few questions from the audience posted on the YouTube, and what I'll do is that we will share it with the panelists separately through email and see that the faculty members and the students who post these questions get their respective answers. I wish we had more time, and but I want to thank Professor Steve and all the panelists for excellent presentations, and particularly the Dr. Jagannathan and Ms. Anupama Ramachandra and Dr. Parivelan and Dr. Samrat Sinha. And thank you very much. It has been a fascinating panel and a lot of interesting points and a lot of learning. And I will share the questions of the audience to you separately on your email, and for preparing a response and sending it to them back. Thank you. Now, with this, we move over to the panel 2. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome the moderator of the second panel, Professor Vaseline Popowski, and all the distinguished panelists of the second panel, Ms. Inakshi Ganguly, Mr. Bablu Loitong-Bam, and my friend Dr. Sadiq Jilani Syed and Mr. Sushil Raj. And they will discuss the strategies to address conflict prevention and resolution. Over to you, Professor Vaseline Popowski.
Thank you very much, Professor Murthy. My honor and pleasure to be with you after some time where we were outside India. I'm back in Sonipat, and this is my first engagement with your excellent conference today on such a timely issue, as the first panel already indicated, how the conflict and the war between Russia and Ukraine, in fact, took our minds in the last days. And it was really something to re-emphasize the importance of the topic which we are going to discuss, strategies for conflict prevention and resolution. As you said, with an excellent panel. I'm going to speak briefly before giving the panelists more time. What is interesting to say here is that the conflict prevention, if it fails, then we need to address the actual armed conflict afterward, the violence afterwards. And the prevention is always the cheaper option, so to speak. If we can gather our efforts and prevent conflicts to occur in the first place, then we will face less demand to address the actual conflict. And that's why many Secretary Generals emphasize the need to focus on preventive diplomacy. Let's mention just Boutros Ghali back in 1992, writing the famous Agenda for Peace and explaining the various roles of the United Nations as preventive diplomacy, peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building. Later, we have Kofi Annan, already in a bit of a different context, with several peace operations in place in Yugoslavia, in Somalia, Haiti, and elsewhere, revisiting the concept of the peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, and again, making that clear that peace building is what prevents conflict to reoccur, to happen again. And based on that, the establishment of the Peace Building Commission came after as another body in the United Nations system to address the need of conflict prevention. Ban Ki-moon followed up with several reports here, the high-level international panel on peace operation 2015 by Ramos Horta, the peace building architecture report, the Women in Peace and Security report. They all emphasize the need to end the fragmentations and the silos that typify the UN responses, to reduce the overall conflict, and therefore that also been very helpful. There are a few problems with prevention, and one of those is that it doesn't attract as much attention in let me just enter. Yeah. I will need to let one person go just briefly. Sorry for that. I would like simply to exemplify this with, for example, the fire. If a building comes into fire, we need the quick reaction, the fire brigade, to come and to stop the fire. But also we need to take action so that the fire doesn't come again. And we need to investigate what happened, the electricity system, the construction, the materials, and to take a longer term approach so that next time the building doesn't get into fire. So we need kind of two sets of agencies. One is to prevent, and here comes everything which was said in the first panel on education is extremely relevant on preventive side, because peace education, the role of the schools and the universities, the public awareness is extremely helpful to prevent conflict to happen. But also we need the second body, so to speak, the fire brigade, those who need rapidly to deploy in conflict zone and to take the necessary action to stop the suffering of the people, to protect civilians, to help the refugees, the displaced people, and so on. So unfortunately, in Ukraine, we see how prevention failed, and therefore we have to engage now a bit late, unfortunately, with some reaction, with some responses. Actually, that's almost what I wanted to say. I wouldn't because we are a bit late already. Again, one problem with the prevention is that it doesn't attract attention, and somehow it's more difficult to generate support, public support, funding, operational action when the outcomes are not as clear as when we have the conflict resolution part. And the conflict resolution, generally, the strategies there are to engage actively, to learn the causes, to clarify the historical positions, but never to engage in historical debates. That's very important in the conflict resolution strategies, to bear in mind the history, but never ask questions about history when the mediators go into the actual negotiations. To bring parties together to talk, and somehow exactly to focus the talk on the future rather than on the past, because talk about the past always divides, but talk about future, what will happen with our children and grandchildren, is the narrative that actually unites everybody. Another conflict resolution strategy is to identify a solution, but to let the parties themselves to deal with and to come up with that solution instead of imposing an external solution. And definitely to monitor and to follow up the process. So these are generally the strategies for conflict resolution. Now, I will move to the panel as I promised. First question goes to Mr. Sushil Raj. Just to say that Sushil Raj is a board member of the New York Peace Institute, a mediator, and former United Nations official with the Department of Political Affairs and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, an extremely experienced person. And I would like to pose the question, what are the concrete strategies and practical solutions for conflict prevention and resolution? And if Sushil can also mention some of the best practices in his experience, it will be most welcome. Over to you, Sushil Raj, now.
Thank you, Professor Popovsky, and thank you everyone for having me. Just to say that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, so the views are my own here. And Professor Popovsky mentioned preventive diplomacy. So that is the line of work that I've come from in the past at the United Nations, in the Department of Political Affairs, where I worked for the Undersecretary General Jeffrey Feltman at the time. Now, when we look at conflict prevention, it's important for us to keep in mind that peace is not a one-off state or a static event in a very dynamic and complex world. Oh, excuse me. Often there's people mistake it as one specific state or one goal to be achieved, which then stays where it is. And that is often not the case. It is a continuous process which requires us to observe, to listen deeply, actively, to dialogue, to really understand where others are coming from. What are their underlying interests? And as Professor Popovsky said, history is a very important marker. It's important to have a deep understanding of history, of context, before going into any dialogue, any negotiation. It's important to be open to compromise, which eventually will lead to transformation, should parties be interested in compromise. Mediation, which I practice actually, is one such tool for conflict prevention. Often mediation happens when conflict is already escalated, but mediation can also be applied at different times and stages of a conflict. And some of the principles for mediation are all about consent. One cannot mediate without the consent of parties. The other very important principle is self-determination. Parties determine their future. They are the ones who will decide which direction it needs to go. Anyone who is mediating, whether that's the UN in a peace process, or whether that's a regional organization or an individual dealing with community disputes or one-on-one disputes, only facilitates that process, which is actually led by the parties. And I reiterate this because it's important to keep that in mind. Often when we see international mediation and negotiations, there is a lot of direction from those who are coming in to discuss with parties. Sometimes there's coercion, sometimes there is very aggressive posturing. So it's very important to keep this in mind when we are looking at mediation and building solutions with the parties. Conflict prevention requires a culture and practice of peace. And I think the previous panel spoke to this at great length in terms of what type of education, what type of values are needed. Conflict prevention also requires us to consistently look at the drivers and triggers of unrest, of violence, even in societies that might appear to be relatively peaceful. We see what happened in New Zealand a few years ago with the attack on a mosque. So this is to say that no society is free of tensions, of conflict, and it's very important to look at what are the underlying drivers of such conflict. Is it extreme poverty? Is it exclusion? Is it social identity that is being instrumentalized or neglected or marginalized? Is it religious intolerance? Is it land and territorial claims or exploitation of natural resources in community and people lands that creates conflict? So, or is it all of these? Is it climate change? We're beginning to see also climate change having an effect on communities, on exacerbating existing tensions. So all of this needs to be looked at. And for those who practice conflict resolution and conflict prevention, it really entails employing skills continuously of examining trends, patterns, looking at early warning, looking at consultation, dialogue, mediation, community-led development. That World Bank, for instance, has been looking at community-driven development models. Or in the case of indigenous communities or minorities, it's self-determined development that they would like to see happen, not from outside forces, but from within. So these are all very essential elements when we're looking at conflict prevention. Professor Popovsky already talked about the international architecture of peace, the Security Council and its many bodies, the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, the Peace Building Commission, which actually is a joint body of the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Economic Social Council, the primary organs, principal organs of the UN. But in all these bodies, UN member states recognize that durable peace has to be locally and nationally led. It cannot be led by outsiders. Now, I was asked for a concrete example. In the course of my work with the UN Department of Political Affairs, which supports preventive diplomacy, it's now known as the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. One such example that I would cite is Burkina Faso between 2013 and 2015, where the then president decided to amend the constitution to extend his term limits, which led to increased number of protests from the opposition side. And these protests then led to instability. The Secretary General's envoy, or special representative of the Secretary General, as he was known and is known, Mohammed Chambas, he came from the regional body called ECOWAS, the Economic Community for West Africa. And he had great standing with both the president of the country and other leaders of the region. So he was involved extensively in convincing President Compaoré to step down, given the opposition, the rising opposition, and to build a transition plan. He did this with other leaders of the region, a transition plan which would lead to elections. Now, as elections were approaching, a coup d'etat took place, an attempted coup d'etat by the former presidential guard, and this was creating a lot of unrest. Again, he was in the country for extended periods of time, and he was able to dissuade those who had attempted the coup that they did not have political support and reinstate the transitional government with the eventual elections taking place. So that was one marker of de-escalating and preventive diplomacy from full-blown conflict. Of course, after the elections, the country still had many drivers of instability and the UN remains engaged. But what can be learned from this example? There are a few different things that can be learned. One was that the UN did have a dedicated regional political office with a Security Council mandate, which was extremely helpful. A highly respected leader in the region who came from the region, knew the culture, knew the dynamics, had credibility in the region. His extended deployment, and the UN provided him with a small aircraft because connectivity in West Africa has never been very good. So we call this airplane diplomacy, where we were working, in fact, even negotiating the budget of his aircraft in the Fifth Committee of the UN to make sure this small plane is available for him to, be able to deploy at moment's notice and go speak to leaders. The other thing that was very essential here was coherent, cohesive messages from him and all the countries of the region. So no one was giving conflicting messages. Everyone was united on these issues. And moreover, and most importantly, the key involvement of civil society in Burkina Faso, consultation with them, bringing them into key moments. This was very, very essential. So this is, of course, member state diplomacy within the UN architecture. But what we see, of course, is the world is changing. There are a lot of localized issues, local conflicts, which were spoken about earlier. And the importance of local and grassroots mediation and local peace builders. They're often not given sufficient attention. Often peace processes are captured by elites and not by those on the ground who are facing these issues. So it's very, very important to look at this. And even in the UN context, as attention shifts to more prevention work from the Secretary General and the machinery, there's great recognition that localized peace building is very, very essential. Local leaders are very essential. Community-led models are very essential. And one example of this is Liberia, where the UN did exit after 15 years of a peacekeeping mission. And while it was successful in disarming about 100,000 combatants and supporting the peace process, the real heroes or sheroes were the women of Liberia. They had organized themselves into mass action groups for peace, often at great risk to themselves, and forced meetings between President Charles Taylor and the rebellion, often being present, and in different shapes and forms advocating for change. They developed into a political force, which eventually brought in the first female president, President Sirleaf, into the country and brought the 14-year civil war to an end. Now, fragility remained in Liberia. There's still ongoing, subnational conflicts and things that happened, but not at the scale that occurred before. So I would just
we are a bit short of time. Yeah. Can you wrap up?
I would just conclude to say, for peace to be transformative, it must really go beyond just the interstate, member state politics. It should look at local elders, local elites, indigenous peoples, minorities. Many conflicts can be resolved locally if people are heard, they're given respect. The wisdom of their social capital is taken on board. Their traditional conflict resolution mechanisms are taken on board. There's no one best practice. We must contextualize, we must critically self-reflect. We must be open to hearing other views. This is something which is a problem. People don't like to hear themselves speak, but are not open to listening to others. And we must rely on local expertise, support, and promote local communities, build trust. So I will pause there. There's a lot to say and look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Sushil. It was a really excellent overview of many, many strategies, both in prevention and in conflict resolution. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Sadiq Sayed, the Regional Program Manager for Ending Violence Against Women and Girls, United Nations Women, East and Southern Africa, with a question. Are there rights-based approaches, and what are the elements of such approaches to be effectively used in the current context? Your time, Sadiq.
Thank you very much. Very good evening, Professor Murthy, Professor Popowski, and also my fellow panelists. Can you hear me, please, sir?
Go ahead.
We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and also the views I am presenting are of my personal views and not related to United Nations. The global military expenditure, it has reached nearly $2 trillion in 2020. It is an increase of 2.6% compared to 2019. And then the military expenditure also reached a global average of 2.4% of GDP globally. If we see historically, conflict-affected countries spend 2 to 3 times more on defense than on health. And when we look into the aspect, as the Professor Popowski rightly observed, there are new methods and dimensions to the armed conflict. There are new tactics used by groups like Al-Shabaab, ISIL, and a number of them. So we need to adapt to the changing times with the new strategies of conflict prevention and resolution. The United Nations has appointed a commission led by Nobel laureate Ramos Horta in 2015 to study and recommend strategies for United Nations effective engagement. And I was privileged to be part of that engagement while serving in Iraq with the United Nations. And we also analyzed, and also I hope that it will change the dimensions and also make the international community or the international institutions more effective. There are also some developments that have adopted, like there is high incidence of conflict-related sexual violence in a number of countries for decades. And the Rome Statute is an example, which has incorporated rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, other forms of sexual violence in Article 6. And also it dealt with crimes against humanity in Article 7. And also it provided opportunity for victims to present their views and observations. As you would agree that women constitute half of the population of the world, and their numbers are often higher in conflict and post-conflict countries. Today, more than 600 million young people in volatile and conflict-prone areas are living. For example, around 75% of Somali population, where I am currently serving, is below the age of 30 years. That is 75% of youth comprise Somali population. And there are, when it comes to the topic, the rights-based approaches, there are 4 types of rights-based approach we commonly apply. These include, firstly, the global compliance based on international and regional treaties. Secondly, the human rights-based programming on the part of development partners, including United Nations and governments. Thirdly, the right to talk, and also fourthly, the legal mobilization. And when it comes to the conflict management and resolution, we also have a number of approaches. We also use bilateral and multilateral negotiation, where my friend Sushil has mentioned earlier, and also mediation and arbitration. Now the question comes, the rights-based, are we really adopting the rights-based approaches to conflict prevention or negotiations? I will speak from a gender perspective or women's rights perspective today. Please allow me to do. Between 1992 to 2019, women were on average just 13% of negotiators, 6% of mediators, and 6% of signatories in major peace processes worldwide. About 7 out of every 10 peace processes did not include any women mediators or women signatories at all. So do we call this process, when the half of the population represented by women are not part of such negotiations and such processes, do we call it a rights-based approach? Do we call it a rights-based peace process, or do we call it an inclusive peace process? So how do we justify those kind of peace processes? Even when we are talking about Ukraine or any context, how many faces or how many heads we see of gender balance? It's really a serious concern that it's a benchmark that we need to adopt. The very foundation of the rights-based approach requires that it should be inclusive, it should be participatory, it should also take care of the concept of the sustainable development goal, which lays the foundation of leaving no one behind. So are we taking into consideration the intersectionality, for example, the rights of persons with disabilities, for example? Then in 2020, women represented 23% of the conflict parties delegations in UN-supported peace processes, a share that would have been even lower without persistence measures by the United Nations. And if we analyze, are we regressing, are we progressing with the rights-based approaches? Analysis shows that the percentage of peace agreements with gender provisions was 28.6% in 2020, which remains well below the peak of 37.1% in 2015. So it is a serious issue. I'm glad that the RV University has brought up this topic at the core of this by bringing together the global experts. Really, we need to analyze, if we were 37.1% of the provisions of those peace agreements had gender incorporated in 2015, it came down to 28.6% in 2020. Isn't it not concerning when we talk about half of the population and their rights? And then research also shows that peace agreements mentioning women, girls, or gender often arise at the comprehensive agreement stage. None of the ceasefire agreements reached between 2018 to 2020 included gender provisions or the prohibition of sexual violence. And when we also look into the leadership and political participation worldwide, 25.5% of all national parliamentarians are women. And when it comes to conflict and post-conflict countries, women's representation in parliament is even lower at 18.9% in 2020. So that shows how conflict impacts women at the parliamentarian or at the leadership at the legislators level. They are severely impacted by that. So my analysis and recommendations are the way forward is following, based on the context that I have explained. There is a misconception that human rights are not applicable during conflict, which is not true. But the fact is human rights are applicable at all times. This is the message that need to reach all. It hasn't reached. I've been serving in conflict countries for more than 20 years now, and we often get to hear there are restrictions there. We do talk about restrictions even under the laws, in any country given context, but there are limited and they are also contextual and they are also subject to some kind of, the rationale. The state remains the primary duty bearer under international law and cannot abrogate its duty to set in place and enforce an appropriate regulatory environment for the private sector activities and responsibilities. And human rights promotion is everyone's role. I always quote, every citizen is a policeman without uniform, or police person or a policewoman without uniform. So that's a concept we should remember, that everyone has a role to play in promoting peace. It's not somebody's role who is holding the blue hats or the uniform. Human rights obligations can also attach to private individuals, international organizations, and other non-state actors. For example, in countries where large portion of territory is under control of non-state actors, like Sudan, Darfur, where I was for more than 5 years, the development partners continued engagement to build their capacities with the SLA, the armed groups there, are the non-state actors. We cannot neglect them. Somebody need to also bring them on board in teaching them human rights. Like they used to detain a number of public servants who are going to provide water, sanitation, and those emergency services. And then they are under detention simply for the reason that they suspect them as spies, and they detain them. Unless they are taught about international humanitarian law, human rights, and they are acquainted with the rights-based approaches, it will be difficult to manage. So this is what I have seen uniquely the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent playing an important role in enlightening or in training the non-state actors with regard to international human rights law and respect to international human rights law. We also see the non-state actors increasingly coming with their declaration and announcement saying that they will abide by and adhere to the international human rights standards. That is the trend that should be there, irrespective of any affiliation or any kind of, the kind of ideology they hold. They should all be respecting the human rights law. That's what I've seen in Darfur, and I see it as a good example. And there is high prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence, and protection of rights of women and girls should be prioritized. It is very significant. It is important. In Darfur, again, we used to see in each of the conflicts, when people are displaced, about 70,000, 80,000, at least 3 to 10,000 women who are affected are sexually abused or raped by armed men. So that also happens in a rampant, huge scale for a period protracted time. So that's also one of the reasons. Many cases go unreported due to stigma, fear, and other reasons. And a growing body of evidence suggests that they can and do play active roles as agents. The women have an important role to play. Our previous speakers and others have alluded to. The youth have an important role to play. As I said, there are a number of youth that are affected by conflict. And it is a fact that they can be the agents of early warning system. They can prevent conflicts. And in human rights, again, when we talk about rights, we always tend to neglect about the rights of the victims. We always think about generating our reports, but whereas the principle of do no harm should be the priority. It is the principle that we need to apply in human rights monitoring, human rights reporting, and research, that I advocate for all the students that they need to take into consideration do no harm in all the times, being legal practitioners or what. And engage women and youth in peace building is important. There is examples of important role played by women in a number of countries such as Liberia, Somalia, Sudan, East Timor, etc. The peace huts established by women in Liberia goes a long way. They have set an example. Anybody can approach the peace huts. The women are there to support them. So these are some of the examples that we can quote. And my colleague earlier mentioned engagement of grassroots CSOs. If we analyze the development programming that is happening in many countries, it happens at the capital city level. So we also need to look into the grassroots civil society organizations who are really torch bearers of providing assistance and promoting peace at the grassroots. If you have to build sustainable peace globally and in any country or any situation, we need to engage and rely on the civil society organizations that are based at the grassroots level. So
thank you, Sadiq. Yes, excellent. Let's move to the next speaker, which is Mr. B'lore Dist.3190 from Manipur. He's the director of the Human Rights Alert. And the question is the role played by the truth commissions in building peace and enabling return to normalcy. How truth commissions help to prevent conflict in the future? Please, your time, B'lore.
Thank you, Professor Popovsky. Yeah, my presentation will be more in terms of our experiences that we are facing in the context of Manipur in particular, but Northeast in general. To put it again, the context from which I am looking at things, it will be probably important for me to quickly have a brief introduction of Northeast. As you know, we are in the extreme east of India, and it has been in the middle of a simmering low-intensity conflict for a long time. Many security measures have been taken up, and a law called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been in operation in this area, where the military can do pretty much what the police are doing in other parts of the country, meaning arrest people, destroy property, or kill people without any legal consequences. We have been documenting cases of extrajudicial killing, torture, rape, disappearances in this for a very long time. And the idea of Truth Commission and how it can play in this context came up precisely in this struggle for human rights and the fight for impunity that we have been undertaking for many decades in this context. We have been documenting cases and trying to raise this at various redress mechanisms, be it at the National Human Rights Commission or in the court of law in the states. Recently, decades ago, we have taken this fight to the Supreme Court of India. And what we are finding is that it is getting increasingly tough to get justice from the ordinary legal process that is available to us, particularly when it deals with the impunity enjoyed by the security forces in these areas. For example, this Armed Forces Special Powers Act was in operation in the Northeast from 1958 onwards. Unfortunately, most of the atrocities or the killings, disappearance, rape that had occurred in the 50s and 60s went undocumented. But there has been some documentation of these events from the late 70s onwards, particularly when the Supreme Court of India have come out with public interest litigation and habeas corpus petitions have been filed. So we have, in 2012, documented 1,528 extrajudicial executions by the police and the military in the state of Manipur from 1979 to 2012, and had moved the Supreme Court with a writ petition seeking that justice should be done on these cases, meaning that criminal prosecution should start. Investigation, of course, has to precede that, and the victims need to be compensated. This date coincided with the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary execution making its maiden visit to India, and the same report was also placed before the Special Rapporteur, and the Special Rapporteur in his reports in the United Nations Human Rights Council as well as to the General Assembly have elaborated extensively on the basis of this report that we have submitted to them. So fortunately, the Supreme Court of India have also taken cognizance of this mass extrajudicial execution that has been taking place in this corner of the country. And they have instituted a commission of inquiry to look into the veracity of this case, headed by Justice Santosh Hegde, a former judge of the Supreme Court of India. And we were fortunate to come with a very clean and strong report from the Supreme Court appointed commission, which had basically stated that none of these cases, the commission was asked to look at 6 cases out of this 1,528 cases, and they have come out with the findings that none of these cases are genuine encounters, and therefore they are what we call in India fake encounters, meaning that these were people who were killed extrajudicially, and none of the victims who were involved or killed have any criminal antecedent and therefore are innocent civilians and not the terrorists, as security forces would inevitably brand them when they submit their reports in any of these killings. So this has put us in a very good position. And in 2016, the Supreme Court have come out with a judgment saying that irrespective of whether there is Armed Forces Special Powers Act or not, every killing should be registered. First information report should be registered, and investigation should take place. However, unfortunately, despite of the Supreme Court judgment, when the Central Bureau of Investigation, the premier investigating agency of India, was asked to investigate 39 incidents out of this, again, 1,528 basket, it is found that when, even after the CBI have given cleansing evidence of the involvement of the armed forces of the Union in killing these innocent civilians, the central government still blocks any kind of prosecution against the military, even though the police who are involved as collaborators are already under prosecution. Now we have about 100 policemen prosecuted. The central government have not given prosecution sanction to any of the armed forces of the Union or the military involved in these killings. So this is a dilemma because on the one hand, despite of the Supreme Court and the premier investigating agency putting strong evidence, the whole justice system is blocked because the central government is not giving permission. We are, of course, trying to persuade the magistrates in the court in Manipur by the argument, pushing the argument that the protection of the Armed Forces Special Power Act should be available only for legal duties that the armed forces are performing, and extrajudicial execution by definition are outside their legal duties, and therefore this protection should not be available and the prosecution should proceed. And if the armed forces personnel would like to defend themselves, they have every opportunity to defend themselves in the process of the trial. But to block the trial just because there is no prosecution sanction, despite of the premier investigating agency giving quite strong evidence about their involvement, would be clearly a violation of human rights. But unfortunately, the lower courts are not able to take a decision on this, and a reference has been made to the Supreme Court, to the high courts, to find out, to give direction as to how they should proceed. So we are facing a dilemma where we are using all possible procedures that is available domestically as well as internationally, and thousands of victims are not able to get justice within the framework that is available in the criminal justice system that is available. On the other hand, since this has been going on for 3 generations now, many victims have already died of old age without seeing justice being done. Under these circumstances, what the victims are proposing is perhaps a truth commission, like as it is done in other transitional justice model, where the truth, justice, reparation, and the guarantee of non-repetition can be guaranteed by evolving some process where the rights of these victims are put at the center of this process, is something that the victims are proposing. Because if we have to wait for this prosecution sanction business to take place, it's going to take decades together. And also in similar contexts like in Kashmir, prosecution sanction have always been denied. So is it now what we are asking is a moot question. If these people which are highly traumatized because of the unlawful killing that their family have suffered, their trauma remains unaddressed, any trigger can again start escalating violence. Fortunately, the violence have come down considerably after this legal process has begun and the investigation and the trial has begun. But unfortunately, this can relapse again if this trauma remain unaddressed. Is there a way in which one can find a way to redress and transform the trauma of these victims to bring some kind of a closure, some kind of an apology from the government, some kind of, memorializing of this horrendous experience of mass extrajudicial execution that this population have faced are some of the questions that is put forward. And we have been pushing this with the government, and particularly now we have elections coming in Manipur, and we are seeking that the political parties, because at the end of the day, it has to be the political executive that puts these processes. And it's interesting that some political parties are interested and have started talking. The former Union Law Minister, Mr. Salman Khurshid, has come down and have met with the victims, and we have discussed this idea and the possibility. If he feels, for example, that if we can start a truth commission in Manipur and start processing some of these very unspeakable truths that the population have experienced, perhaps, again, this has to, of course, evolve through a dialogue process between the power that be and the victims. And if a process like this can take place where the entire truth is digged out, the restitution question of the victims are addressed, and some strategic prosecution can ensure that at least the big fishes are catched, then perhaps this can work out as a model for other parts of India which have also gone through similar traumatic experience, be it Punjab, be it Chhattisgarh, and who knows, someday perhaps in Jammu and Kashmir. But this is still an open question, and the victims' communities are prepared in Manipur. However, we have to wait for the right time and the right political kind of atmosphere to prevail in this country to see if such an experiment can be carried out. Yes. And it requires a vision and determination.
Thank you, B'lore. I will say not only other parts in India, but other parts in the world need to follow the examples you gave now. It's very important to know the truth, to know what happened, to keep the record, and to help the reconciliation of the next generations. Now, the last speaker, but not the least, and one of the most privileged, I'm privileged to introduce Enakshi Ganguly, who is the co-founder and advisor to the Hack Center for Child Rights in Delhi, and also an honorary professor in the National Law University in Odisha, to tell us her experience and how women can play a role in peace building. Your time, Enakshi.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all my co-panelists and all those who have taken out the time to join us online. I feel privileged to be invited to speak at the International Conference on Peace and Conflict Prevention, right? On how can protection of rights of women and children contribute to peace. Thank you, Dr. Murthy, for including me. Thank you, Dr. Popowski, for highlighting some of the key concerns and mentioning children and grandchildren, and Mr. Sushil Raj for flagging many of the causes that cause conflict. When one is a last speaker, most of the script that one has prepared is already spoken. So, but I shall try to be to highlight some new issues. We have already been reminded that this conference is being organized in real time as we are bombarded with images of the war in Ukraine. As its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, reminded the world that even though today it's Ukraine, no one will remain unaffected by the war. And that indeed is the truth. Last night, I opened my Instagram and up came a video of newborn babies being moved to a bomb shelter in Ukraine. Yet again, the impact of war and conflict on children came home starkly. Over the last decades, we have seen what's been happening to families, women, children across several countries and across several continents. Some of these images refuse to go away. To prepare for this evening, I decided to ask my friends their thoughts. Dr. Saida Hamid immediately shared a few lines by one of the great Indian poets, Sahil Ludhianvi, which echoes the Ukrainian president. And these are the lines. Khoon apna ho ya paraya ho, nasle adam ka khoon hai aakhir. Jang मशरिक में हो या मागरिब में, अमन इस आलम का खून है आखिर. This translates, and I'm no Urdu expert, but I'm trying. Whether the blood is ours or someone else's, it's the human blood that is shed. Whether the war is in the East or the West, it's the world peace that is killed. All children and young people need to be reminded of these lines, especially in an environment of othering that seems to predominate us today. Another friend, Anchal Kapoor, responded with this. Peace is about comprehensive human security. If we protect rights of women and children to live violence-free, to have basic food, shelter, clothing, water and sanitation, and dignity of livelihood, we will contribute in the creation of a peaceful society. Women and children have a role to play in nurturing and sharing love in their personal and peer relationships. Love is a crucial ingredient for peace as is safety and security. I also felt that I should delve into my own experience. My parents are refugees of partition of India, as were my husband's parents. Mine from the East and his from the West. They saw conflict and were affected by it lifelong. It has stayed with them. And yet, when my father, as a very young man, saw Muslims being attacked and looted on a train going to East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, by young men in the small town that he lived, he decided to step in and stop it. And he did not care that at that moment he was alone. He had clearly imbibed the lessons on tolerance and non-discrimination very early in life as a child, and that helped him to stand his ground as a young adult. The secure and protected, loving environment he grew up in had instilled this in him. When I was young, I lived in and witnessed ethnic conflict in the northeastern state of Meghalaya, where I was born in. Bablu belongs to Manipur. This is part of the Seven Sisters in the Northeast. In the face of the growing conflict, where we as Bengalis became the targets of ethnic conflict, my parents decided to leave a second time. However, the impact of the conflict on my family and others has stayed with me. The sound of the stones on the tin roof and the shattering of glass in the windows still haunts all of us. My aunt and I spoke about this last week when I was visiting. And yet, I have strongly believed that I will not hate those who stoned my home and forced me and my family to leave. It's sometimes hard, but we cannot give up. But this is what we were taught as children, and we live as adults. At HUC, we have documented impact of conflicts on children in areas affected by violence, by left-wing activists or Naxals, religious and ethnic conflicts. As part of the fact-finding mission with the National Commission for the Protection of Child Rights, I met with women and children caught in ethnic conflict between tribal groups in Upper Assam. It has always been a heartbreaking experience. I'm also a member of the independent coalition of individuals called the Forum for Human Rights in Jammu and Kashmir. While whole communities struggle, it's the women and the children who face the double whammy of gender and age. Girls and women become unprotected and face gender-based violence. Mr. Sadiq Syed has spoken in some detail on this. Children may lose parents, grow up without the most basic services. We have seen how they get drawn into the conflict as participants in the violence, which in turn completely destroys their childhood. Many suffer psychological trauma. They are all caught in a web of violence, illiteracy, neglect, and of fear with no hope for the future. As we are often reminded by several people, peace is not just about the absence of war or conflict. To these words, Nelson Mandela added, peace is the creation of an environment where all can flourish regardless of race, color, creed, religion, gender, class, caste, or any other social markers of difference. Martin Luther King Jr. added, it's the presence of justice. Spinoza added, it is a virtue, a state of mind, a disposition for benevolence, confidence, justice. Einstein said, I added to this line, the presence of justice, of law, of order, in short, of government. And my friend Anchal added, peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of love and security. What is common to all is the presence of justice. And as was pointed out earlier, this is not about access to justice only, but an environment in which social and economic justice prevails. Without the respect for human rights and protection of those rights of children, gender rights, a just society is not possible. Tolerance and non-discrimination is the key. And of course, access to justice is often affected by social and political environment that prevails. And we are seeing that in our country and many others around us. There are several international standards that address children's rights in conflict. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on involvement of children in armed conflict. Others are the Geneva Convention, the protocols additional to the Geneva Convention. The International Labour Office has deemed use of children in conflict as the worst forms of child labor. And there are, I will not go into the long list that exists. All have today come to provide a strong and significant body of norms and standards for the protection of children from the impact of armed conflict. To protect children from the impact of armed conflict, the United Nations created a mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General in 1996. In 2005, the United Nations Security Council established in Resolution 1612 that the UN Secretary General would be monitoring and would have a monitoring and reporting mechanism managed by the country-based task force, co-led by UNICEF and the highest UN representative in the country to provide timely and reliable information on the 6 grave children's rights violations. These are abuses, and these abuses include killing or maiming of children, recruitment or use of children by armed forces or armed groups, attacks on schools or hospitals, rape or other sexual violence against children, abduction of children, and the denial of humanitarian access to children. As per the Juvenile Justice Care and Protection Act of 2020, children who are victims or affected by any armed conflict, civil unrest, or natural calamity are children in need of care and protection. This is a very big step by the Government of India in not just recognizing the vulnerability of such children, but also need to protect their rights and entitlements. We also have the National Policy for Children and the National Plan of Action for Children that deals with child protection in all situations. Similarly, there are several international standards for women. However, all legal standards, national and international, is only as good as the intent of the government that implements them, or a society that really wants to change the norms and the terms of engagement. At the same time, conflict is at several levels. Conflict can find children in the variety of situations and locations, such as schools, on the playground, at the practice fields, or at home. This is true of women too. This everyday conflict that they confront diminishes their capacity to confront or address the ones that are created by those that are made by politics of the state, religion, and ethnic differences. Einstein has said it was the presence of the government that was necessary for peace. We have governments, but it does not help that we are living in times where we witness state actions that are based on discrimination and othering. The environment that the state creates breaks the hearts and minds of people, dividing them by pitting them against one another. It drives fear, leading to unhealthy thoughts and actions, especially when it gratifies those who are the drivers of creating fear and othering. And yet, we cannot lose hope. We have seen from experiences across the world that women and children themselves can play an important role in peace. And there are so many examples from this, on this from countries across the globe. Bablu, my co-panelist, will tell you about Meera Paibi, women torchbearers of Manipur who have led the fight against state violence and the movement for peace since 1977. There is a Naga Mothers Association which has tried to address problems of conflict, peace building, and substance abuse by creating a platform for dialogue that brings together disparate voices. The Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons in Kashmir, which has a number of women leading it. The Women's Initiative for Peace in South Asia, WIPSA, formed in 1999, led the exchange of women's delegations from India and Pakistan visiting each other. It also organized programs involving women from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. Writers and artists met to address peace in the region. Sushil Raj spoke about the role of women in Liberia. But as Mr. Sadiq Syed reminded us, the role of women in official peace processes leaves a lot to be desired. Samrat Sinha reminded us of some important programs that were have directed at children in India. However, in a world where we as adults have failed to stem discrimination and othering, our hope has to be the young people of today, the adults of tomorrow. But for that to happen, we have to instill in them tolerance and non-discrimination. We have to enable and empower them to dissent, which I know is a challenge where even adults fear to do so. But we have to keep hoping. In our hope lies our only hope of change. It is the schools and the education system that the first panel talked about that plays a critical role in this. Like we saw with my father, what they learn as children stays with them as adults. At the end of the day, each and every one of us is actually seeking peace, joy, absence of conflict, not just big, large warlike conflicts, but everyday conflicts so that they can be in peace, not just at peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ganguly. This is really inspirational. And thank you not only for your speech, but also for your work you are doing in the Hack Center for Child Rights. Now, Professor Murthy, do you want me to quickly respond to a few of the questions?
Yes, in 5 minutes, if you can quickly
I will
take that questions.
Before giving you back.
Some of the questions more questions have come, but we will take them over email. Yeah.
Absolutely. Some of the questions are actually very related, and they deal with the frustration with the United Nations not being able to stop aggressors, and not only now the Russian aggression to Ukraine, but also historically some major disappointments with the United Nations Security Council in particular, and questions about the veto, whether that needs to be abolished, and what else can the United Nations do in a situation where a permanent member of the Security Council imposes a veto. Again, very fundamental questions, and unfortunately the system is, the Security Council is like that. There are 5 permanent members with the right of veto, and as you know, the permanent member can impose a veto and remain outside the law of the Security Council sanctions. But still, I guess what can be done is to utilize the General Assembly, and the majority there can be a very strong signal of the world community against an aggressor. What can also be done is to impose sanctions. Actually, for the sanctions, you don't need Security Council resolution. Every single country in the world can individually or collectively can impose, and many did against Russia and against previous aggressors. You need resolution only for the use of force, but for the sanctions, that's not necessary. And we see that that also been done. A question about the Indian membership in the Security Council, and I will kind of bring together also the other candidates, Japan, Germany, Brazil, South Africa, and others. I guess that will be very helpful, and it is also connected to the issue of veto. What the candidates for permanent membership should declare is that they are happy to join as a permanent, but without the veto, and that will be a strong signal to the current 5 not to utilize veto specifically for situations of mass atrocities like those. A great question by a student about the diversity, and is diversity helpful in prevention and peace building? Absolutely yes. Actually, the opposite of the intolerance, the denial of the rights of the minorities, and that's what creates problem. Nationalism creates conflicts, and diversity is part of the solution. And as many of the speakers in this panel mentioned, the role of the women, of the young people, of the students is specifically crucial here. If you look at the last report by the Secretary General, Our Common Agenda in September 2021, no other reports in the UN history has put so much emphasis on future generation. Actually, the Trusteeship Council, one of the defunct body, will be repurposed as to address the future generations. Youth, young people, students are now very much invited to join other actors and agencies in the peace process. Actually, published a book about the role of women and children in peace building, and these are really fundamental factors in building peace. So definitely diversity does help. It's not an obstacle. On the opposite, everybody, all the minorities, all vulnerable people, all the victims need to be engaged in the process of peace building. And finally, the question about space as a global commons and how that needs, and it's not new, by the way, the efforts to create a peaceful outer space, the conventions of the law of the sea, but also of outer space are not new. But the new is this emphasis on the global commons and the opportunity with the modern technology of the United Nations and the world to prevent hostile actions in the outer space. And again, the Secretary General B'lore Common Agenda very much reflects and gives opportunities for that. Excellent panel. I enjoy all 4 or even all 8 speakers today. Well done, Professor Murthy, bringing those people together. And back to you for the final vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Vasilin Popowski. Strategies for conflict prevention and resolution is a very fertile topic and requires a lot more time. And I want to personally thank each one of you, like starting with you for your opening remarks and the closing ones, and also all the Mr. Sushil, Dr. Sadiq Jilani Syed, and Bablu, and Ms. Inakshi for their excellent presentations. And we are going to compile a detailed report on this conference, and we'll try to document all these important strategies and practical solutions to our current problems. And I want to profusely thank like Dr. Vasilin and all the speakers for their excellent perspectives. And now I hand over the floor to Peace and Conflict Resolution Director, Rotary District 3190, Rotaractor Dr. Vasuki Krishnan, for giving a vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Vasudeva Kudumpakam is a Sanskrit term that we say, which means that all world is one and all its people are a family. At this time and situation, the conversation of peace and conflict resolution is therefore very necessary in the interest of this very family. I'm Rotaractor Dr. Vasuki Krishnan, Peace and Conflict Resolution Director of Rotaract District 3190, and I'm honored to be presenting the vote of thanks today. First, I would like to thank both Rotarian CAR Mahesh Iyer, President, and his Board of Directors at Rotary eClub of Bangalore District 3190, India, for coming up with this amazing International Peace Conference project during Rotary's Peace Month in collaboration with RV University. In particular, this conference would have never been possible without Rotarian Professor Ysr Murthy, Vice Chancellor, RV University, who single-handedly reached out to all the speakers and moderators, securing their consent, getting an invite designed, evolving a concept paper, and in organizing the conference in a record time of 2 weeks. Thank you very much, sir. Today, we had the honor of listening to 2 very important panels on peace, and I would like to thank each of the panelists from various parts of the world for joining us today. The panel 1 was on role of education institutions in promoting peace. The moderator, Professor Stephen P. Marks, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Health and Human Rights, USA. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving your insights, sir. Professor Dr. J. Jagannathan, National Security Studies, Central University of Jammu. Professor Dr. K.M. Parivelan, CSRS, School of Law, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Professor Dr. Samrat Sinha, Center of Border Studies, O.P. Jindal Global University. Rotarian Ms. Anupama Ramachandra, Principal of Delhi Public School, Electronic City, Bangalore. It was a greatly engaging and informative panel on promoting peace education at every stage of life. As a student myself, I learned a lot from the panelists today. The second panel was on strategies for conflict prevention and resolution. The moderator, Professor Dr. Vasilin Popovsky, Vice Dean, Center for Studies of United Nations, JGLS. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir. Professor Ms. Inakshi Ganguly, co-founder of HARC, Center for Child Rights, Delhi, Honorary Professor in NLU, Odisha. Mr. Bablu Loitenham, Director, Human Rights Alert, Manipur. Dr. Sadiq Jinani Syed, Regional Program Manager, EVAW, with UN Women of East and Southern Africa. Mr. Sushil Raj, Mediator and Board Member, New York Peace Institute, Wildlife and Conservation Society. We got to listen to the panelists talk about engaging everyone in conversations on conflict resolution in spite of our differences and diversity. Thank you so much for your insights. I would also like to acknowledge the RVU faculty and students, in particular, the support of Mahatma Gandhi Center for Contemporary Ethics, IT team for their technology support, communications team for their PR support, and student volunteers. We also acknowledge the Rotary eClub Bangalore program team of Rotarian Mahesh Iyer, Rotarian Ysr Murthy, Rotarian Mohan Nallu, Rotarian Asha Nair, Rotarian Ashish Datta, Rotarian Anupama Ramachandra, Rotarian Kavita Subramaniam, Rotarian Archana Badri, who are working behind the scenes to secure an active participation on YouTube along with Rotary District 3190 Secretariat. Finally, I would like to thank all the audience and viewers for attending this event, asking relevant questions, and inculcating peace and conflict resolution talks in their daily conversation and spreading peace and love. May the world with its families live in harmony. Thank you all once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Colleagues. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Anupama. Thank you.
Bye-bye.